is your ticket to a world of mystery, nightmares, and the supernatural. Get ready for a journey to the scariest places. But remember, once you open this door, there's no turning back. Ready to explore the secrets in the dark.
It was September of 1984. The cold was slowly making its presence felt, and the villagers were preparing for winter. I woke up early in the morning and let the animals out of the barn. A few days ago, the handle of the axe had broken, so that morning I sat in the courtyard, repairing it. My house was located about 50 meters from an area the villagers called the deserted graveyard. My late parents rested there, and for the past week, I had been hearing strange sounds from that graveyard. Even when repairing the handle of the axe, I was disturbed by the same sounds. However, as usual, I decided to continue my work. About 5 minutes later, the same sounds began to echo more distinctly. This time, it was as if someone was making an urgent call for help. I quickly threw the axe handle aside and ran towards the graveyard. The graveyard was covered with old birch, fir, and oak trees, so it didn't get much light even during daylight. The sound was getting stronger, and I could now clearly hear the words being spoken. I heard echoes of words like, "We came to take, you wouldn't do it." As I proceeded a bit further, I noticed words written in ancient letters resembling Arabic on the trunk of the birch tree next to my parents' grave. Halil, the son of Mehmet Ah, one of the village elders, was someone interested in mysterious matters and a trusted friend of mine. I immediately invited him to my house and told him about the unusual thing I had seen. After some thought, he said, "I don't know what it says, but I know someone who might. Perhaps we can find out." While we were talking, Halil decided to repair the broken handle of the axe. The sun was slowly setting, and evening had arrived. After bidding farewell to Halil, I retired to my home and lay down in bed. Memories of my parents came to mind. I had lost them as a child, and I had never been able to fully learn the cause of their death. My uncle had raised me, but there was something I had heard from the neighbors. My parents had hanged themselves at dawn while I was asleep. When I brought up the topic with my uncle, he either closed the conversation or brushed me off, and eventually he asked me not to inquire further. The incident I experienced today triggered the recall of this dark truth. I spent a sleepless night, waiting for the sunrise. In the early hours of the morning, I opened the barn door and let the animals out. After breakfast, I headed straight to Mehmet Aya's house. Halil noticed me while chopping wood in the yard, dropped the axe, and said, "Welcome, brother," inviting me inside. We chatted. I told him about the nightmare I had last night and asked about the meaning of the Arabic words. Halil said the word meant cursed and reassured me, saying, "You might be affected by yesterday's writing. There's nothing to worry about," which eased my mind a bit. During our conversation, Halil's mother, Aunt Zainab, entered the room. As far as I knew, Zainab Aunt was always silent. She never spoke, and I never asked Halil out of respect. However, Aunt Zainab seemed a bit harsher this time. I hadn't seen even the slightest smile on her face until now, apart from a few smiles. Halil said, "Come on, let's take another look at that writing, brother." I replied, "Sure," and we set out together. As we walked towards the graveyard, I asked with curiosity, "Halil, who is the person you mentioned? Whose descendant is he?" Halil, in a mysterious manner, replied, "I swore not to say anything about the man, Ali. You'll see when he comes, anyway," he said. I decided not to insist further. When we reached the graves, we noticed that the tree branch covering my parents' grave was broken. We quickly lifted the branch, and suddenly Halil started screaming. A black snake had appeared on my mother's grave. Laughing, I said, "Is this what I was afraid of, my brother?" and chased the snake away from my mother's grave with a branch. Halil's face had turned pale. While Halil was sitting in the courtyard, I went inside to make tea. While inside, Halil suddenly shouted the Arabic word we had seen on that tree. I dropped what I was holding and rushed outside. "What happened, my brother?" I asked. Halil turned to me with a puzzled look. "I didn't call you," he said. "You shouted the Arabic word just now, my brother. Anyway, sorry." "I think I'm still under the influence of the dream," I said, but I was sure Halil had shouted. When I brought the teas to the courtyard, Halil had his eyes wide open, staring at me. The sun was slowly setting. Halil said, "If you want, I can stay with you tonight, my brother. You seem quite affected." I said, "Am I a child, my brother? It's just a dream." I bid farewell to Halil. I put the animals in the barn and went inside. I made Turkish coffee, sat on the mat, and began to contemplate the events of the past 2 days. The evening call to prayer was being recited. Coffee hadn't kept me awake, but rather had intensified my drowsiness. I got up from the mat, washed the cup, and then lay down for a while. Suddenly, lightning struck, and the house was illuminated. At the door, I saw my mother and father. Lightning struck again, and this time they were right in front of me. My mother had a black snake in her hand, and neither of them had pupils. My mother was shouting the Arabic word again. She put the black snake on me, and then suddenly, both of them disappeared. Lightning struck again, and on the ceiling of the house, I saw them hanging by their necks. The snake coiled around my neck and began to tighten. Suddenly, I was startled by the sound of the morning call to prayer. The dream from yesterday came to my mind. Once again, I had seen my mother and father hanging themselves. This incident had begun to infuriate me more than scare me. This time, I fell asleep while waiting for the sunrise. I opened my eyes with the crowing of roosters, got up, and washed my face. I opened the door of the barn, and one of the animals was lying on the ground. No matter how hard I tried to get it up, it didn't budge. I went to the courtyard and started having breakfast when suddenly, it screamed and started running outside. I ran to it with loud shouts. Entering the barn and looking at the place where the animal was lying, I saw the black snake we had seen in the grave yesterday. I rushed to the house to get the scythe to cut off the snake's head. When I got back, it was not in its place. Despite searching thoroughly, I couldn't find it. With that fatigue, I went to the courtyard to rest. At that moment, Halil arrived and said that the man we were expecting would come today. I had said he would come in 3 days, I remarked. You can never predict that man. Ali might say, "I'll come in a month," and then show up a week later. We went together to Halil's house and started waiting for the man in the courtyard. Before long, a 15-16-year-old boy arrived and said to Halil, "Brother, Kamal uncle is waiting for you." Halil and the young boy who came to fetch us set out. As we approached the house, about 5 kilometers beyond the village, among the beech trees, we saw a mysteriously dilapidated house standing. I had seen this house a few times before while grazing the animals, but I had never entered it. As we approached the house, the young boy who had called us said, "I can come this far, you guys go ahead," and walked away. Halil continued nonchalantly, and I followed behind him. The house was surrounded by stone walls, and its garden could be entered through an iron gate. When we reached the iron gate, Halil hit the gate strongly and said, "Wait here." A tall man wearing a black turban emerged from behind the gate. I guessed it was Kamal's uncle. The man approached the gate with a slight stumble and welcomed us. He looked at us and gestured to his house, inviting us in. I noticed the Arabic writings on the door, and a strange sense of unease crept over me. The inside of the house was filled with a foul odor, and there were small animal parts everywhere. A peculiar symbol drawn in red paint on the wall caught my attention. Pointing to the brown cushions on the floor, the man said, "Please, have a seat." As we sat down, Halil narrated the events at the graveyard, and I shared the dreams I had experienced in the last 2 days. After listening, the man stared into my eyes for a while. Then he asked for the names of my mother and father. I said Safiye and Suleiman. The man wrote Arabic words on the papers and added another word after asking for my name. He stood up, took the copper bowl standing on the large wooden table and sat back down. Dipping his bowl into the murky water on the bowl, he fetched water and dried his hands with an old cloth. Then he threw the Arabic words he had written on the paper into the water. After reading something for about 15 minutes, he breathed on the bowl and told me, "Drink this water." I hesitated to drink the water, but the man's long efforts made me feel a drinking obligation, and I drank it. After drinking, Uncle Kamal asked me to look into his eyes, and when I looked into his eyes, I felt a sensation of yawning. The mystery of the incident was growing with each passing moment. After yawning several times, Uncle Kamal waited silently, staring into my eyes for a long time. Then, with an annoyed expression, he said, "Let's take a look at that grave." We went outside together and headed towards the cemetery. When we arrived at the village, the sun was about to set. Halil turned to Kamal Uncle, saying, "Stay with us tonight. We'll solve the problem during daylight tomorrow." Kamal Uncle thought for a moment, then turned to me and said, "I heard you live alone. It would be more appropriate for me to be a guest in your house tonight." I didn't want Uncle Kamal to stay in my house, but I felt a great responsibility, so I nodded. Halil went inside, and Kamal Uncle and I set out towards my house. Suddenly, he turned to me, smiled, and said, "There's a great danger upon you, my son. We will save you from this danger." With this sentence, I began to trust Uncle Kamal a bit more. We arrived home, and I prepared a place for Uncle Kamal and brewed tea. Uncle Kamal had been looking at the ceiling since we entered the house, but due to my shyness, I didn't dare to ask. "Strange, very strange," he said. "What's wrong, Uncle Kamal?" I asked. "It doesn't matter. Just serve the tea and let's have some," Uncle Kamal said. After drinking our tea, we started chatting. I explained the events in detail, but Uncle Kamal just listened with a nod. He didn't offer any comforting words about the incident. "I feel sleepy. Is my place ready?" he asked. Despite not liking his tone, I said, "Ready, Uncle. Please come in." I showed him his place, and he lay down. After tidying up around, I also lay down. A voice came from the room where Uncle Kamal was lying inside. It was hard to understand exactly what he was saying. I quickly entered the room. Uncle Kamal was standing with his back turned. Suddenly, he turned to me and smiled, starting to approach me with slow steps. The room had suddenly darkened for some reason. Uncle Kamal was not visible, and I shuddered with a sudden pain in my left arm. When I raised my arm, I saw a black snake coiled around my wrist. For a brief moment, it illuminated as well, and there was no more than a step's distance between Uncle Kamal and me. He had no pupils. He pointed upward, saying, "You're dead, my boy." "Up there," he said. I saw my parents hanging by their necks. Their tongues were hanging out. Their faces were purple, and their eyes were wide open, staring into my eyes. I suddenly jumped. The morning call to prayer was being recited again. I had somewhat accustomed myself to these kinds of dreams. With all my composure, I went to the room where Uncle Kamal was supposed to be, but he was not there. At that moment, I heard a sound from outside and went out. Uncle Kamal was standing in front of the door, watching the garden. I called out to him, and he turned to me, saying, "Stay inside." I didn't understand what was happening. I went inside and waited for Uncle Kamal to come. Soon, he entered. He told me the prayers I needed to recite and went to his room. I did as he instructed and then lay down. I woke up to the sound of the door. Halil had arrived. I got up and opened the door. At that moment, Uncle Kamal also came out of his room, greeted Halil. We had breakfast together in the courtyard. I repeated the things I did every day, and they chatted in the courtyard. Suddenly, Uncle Kamal stood up saying, "It's time. Let's take a look at that grave." We set out together. As we entered the cemetery, I heard Uncle Kamal saying something in Arabic. When he saw the writing on the tree at the head of the graves, he started yawning again, just like he did yesterday. I couldn't make sense of this yawning. I turned to Halil and asked him why this is happening, my brother. Halil put his index finger to his mouth, gesturing for me to stay quiet. Uncle Kamal's yawning had stopped and he turned to me saying, "Why did your mother and father die?" I told them that my parents had died when I was young, that fate had come and taken their lives, and I didn't know more. Uncle Kamal remained silent for a while. Without waiting for him to speak, I asked, "What does it say on that tree, Uncle?" He looked at the tree and said it was written in 1951. At first I couldn't make sense of this number, but then the date of my mother and father's death came to my mind. 1951. I told Uncle Kamal about this date. He continued to look at the tree for a while, then suddenly turned to me and said, "There is a spell on this tree, son. Let's go inside. I'll tell you a few things." In amazement, without asking anything, I walked towards the house. Uncle Kamal and Halil followed, talking quietly behind me. When we reached the house, I saw Halil's mother, Aunt Zeynep, standing in front of the stable door, looking at the stable with her back turned. I called out to her, but she continued to stare at the stable without changing her posture. Halil took his mother's arm, brought a towel, seated her on a chair, and asked me to bring her a glass of water. I brought the water. Aunt Zeynep drank it, and suddenly stood up, heading towards her house. When Halil asked what his mother was looking at, he said she had been behaving like this for about 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Uncle Kamal looked at Halil sternly and said, "Go to your mother." Halil headed towards his house without understanding what had happened. Kamal uncle entered the house angrily, and I followed him inside. I asked, "What happened, uncle?" Kamal uncle furrowed his brows. "That woman is not good, my son. She's bewitched." I knew Aunt Zeynep well. She hadn't harmed me until now, and I even liked her. I was a bit surprised by Kamal uncle's words, but I didn't pay much attention to them. Shortly after our conversation, Halil arrived at the house yelling, and we quickly went outside with Kamal uncle. Halil shouted, "Something happened to my mother. Help!" We ran towards the house, and Kamal uncle was a bit behind due to his leg discomfort. When we reached Aunt Zeynep's room, she was lying stretched out on the floor, staring at the ceiling, trembling. Kamal uncle immediately entered and began reading Arabic words aloud. As he read, Aunt Zeynep's trembling intensified. Aunt Zeynep suddenly stood up, looked into my eyes, and said the same Arabic word again. A few seconds later, she fainted. I was looking at Kamuran uncle and Halil in fear. Aunt Zeynep was a woman who never spoke, and now how could she talk? More than her speech, the words she uttered frightened me. I wished all this was just a dream. Kamal uncle shouted at Halil, telling us to leave the house. Together with Halil, we ran to the courtyard. Inside, Kamal uncle was reciting verses loudly, and we heard screams. The screams were coming from Aunt Zeynep. Halil couldn't resist and went inside, and I followed him. Aunt Zeynep was lying on the floor with blood around her mouth. Kamal uncle, without paying attention to the bloody object in his hand, went out to the courtyard. Halil moved his mother to her room, and I followed Kamal uncle to the courtyard. As Kamal uncle washed his hands, I examined the bloody object he placed on the marble stone in the courtyard. At that moment, Kamal uncle told me not to touch that thing under any circumstances. When I asked what it was, He looked into my eyes and said it was a part of a ruthlessly performed spell. The thing on the marble stone had a flesh-like structure. One side was slightly whitened, while the other side was blackened. When Halil arrived, Kamal uncle explained to him exactly what he had told me. About an hour later, we all entered the room where Aunt Zainab was lying semi-conscious. Kamal uncle recited in Arabic, and Zainab aunt was being comforted by these recitations. Zainab aunt sighed a bit more and said to Kamal uncle, "May Allah bless you." The fact that the woman, who had not spoken for years, spoke because of what Kamal uncle did surprised me even more. Kamal uncle asked Zainab aunt about the reason she stopped speaking. Zainab aunt frowned, and as she looked at me, I couldn't understand the meaning of her gaze. I was getting increasingly frustrated. At that moment, Zainab aunt raised her only arm and pointed at me with her index finger, saying that the reason was a spell cast by her uncle Ibrahim. Halil turned to me and shouted, "What did you do to my mother?" Kamal uncle grabbed Halil by the shoulder and pulled him towards himself. I had no knowledge of what had happened to Zainab aunt. I only remembered that my uncle, when he saw Zainab aunt, bowed his head and didn't look at her face. I left the place with a sad and angry mood, and Kamal uncle followed me. "Go home. I'll learn about the events and come," he said. After what Halil had said, I didn't want to stay much longer. I went home without objecting. A few hours later, Kamal uncle came, looking at me in amazement. "Tell me about your uncle. What was he like? What did he do?" he asked. I mentioned that he was a bit stern and engaged in livestock farming like me. Kamuran uncle fell silent for a while, inspecting the ceiling. Suddenly, he went outside, took the log I used for chopping wood, and placed it in the center of the room. Climbing onto it, he looked at the ceiling. After descending from the log, he moved it to a different position. We were watching him without asking what he was doing. There was a small hole on the ceiling towards the door. He slowly tapped the middle of the small hole with his hand. A round wooden piece entered inside, and enough space was opened in the ceiling for a human hand. He reached in and found an amulet wrapped in a black cloth. I continued to watch him in astonishment without asking what he was doing. He descended from the log and sat on the mat, carefully opening the amulet. After opening the amulet, he took out a cloth from the inner pocket of his robe. As soon as he removed the cloth, a foul smell filled the room. It was the piece of meat. While cutting the meat on the cloth with his knife, another amulet emerged from within. I was becoming increasingly bewildered, and a sense of fear was growing within me. While watching Kamal uncle perform these actions, I was startled by the sound of the door. Halil entered, glaring at me angrily as he stepped inside and sat next to Kamal uncle. I closed the door and joined them, and nobody was speaking. "We need to go to my house. Everything I need is there, and the sooner we get there, the better," Kamal uncle said. We hurriedly set out, and by the time we reached the house, it was dark. Kamal uncle lit a few candles and placed them in the corners of the room. He also took another gas lamp and sat down. Halil and I sat opposite him. He read the writings inside the amulet, then took a length of twine and tied 4 knots. He placed the amulets into the murky water in the copper bowl. Handing me the twine, he said, "Hold the twine over the bowl, repeat what I say, and untie one of the knots each time I bow my head." I did as he instructed. He retrieved the papers from the water and instructed me to drink it. After drinking the water, Kamal uncle said, "We will stay here tonight." Halil said he needed to be with his mother. Kamal uncle nodded and bid farewell to Halil. Halil not even looking at me when leaving the house surprised and saddened me. Exhausted from not understanding the events that had taken place, I followed Kamal uncle to the sleeping area, and he reassured me, saying, "Don't be afraid, you'll sleep well tonight." I lay down and pondered the events of the day. As I drifted off to sleep, I was startled by a scream. When I sat up and rubbed my eyes, a terrifying scene unfolded before me. Kamal uncle, Halil, Zainab aunt, my mother, father, and my uncle Ibrahim were all sitting in a row, kneeling, looking at me and smiling. I quickly got into bed and pulled the blanket over my head. After a few seconds, someone pressed on my shoulders and laid me flat on my back. I couldn't see anything from under the blanket and I couldn't move. I was frozen, as if I woke up with the call to prayer. I felt pain in my shoulder. Kamal uncle had mentioned that I would sleep well today. However, what did the dream I had mean? I waited for Kamal uncle to wake up. He woke up with the sunrise. I went to him and told him about the dream I had seen. Looking at me, she said, "This matter will be resolved today. Don't worry." After breakfast, we set out together. Halil greeted us at the garden gate. I learned that Aunt Zainab wanted to talk to me. As we were about to enter the house, I noticed Aunt Zainab coming to the courtyard. Approaching her, I gave Aunt Zainab a wordless look. She pointed to the chair and said, "Sit." She took a seat opposite me. Then she said the following words: "Your uncle, your mother, and your father cast a spell on me, son." Because of that, I couldn't speak for a long time. Looking at Aunt Zainab in astonishment, after a moment of silence, I asked, "How is that possible?" Aunt Zainab began to narrate her experiences. My father and uncle had found a great treasure in their time. Jealous of my father, my uncle had found a sorcerer from neighboring villages to extract the treasure. The sorcerer claimed that the treasure was owned by jinn, and it could only be extracted through a deal. My father initially did not want to admit it, but my uncle forced him to accept, and they extracted the treasure. My mother and Aunt Zainab were very close friends, and when my father told her about these events, I couldn't help but tell Aunt Zainab. One day, Aunt Zainab saw my uncle on the street and told him that she knew everything, and unless she received a share of the treasure, she would tell the whole village. Although she regretted saying this afterward, it was too late. My uncle did not want to share the treasure with anyone. To be the sole owner of the treasure, he had a spell cast on my mother and father. I was 4 years old at that time. One day, Aunt Zainab came to our house. Upon entering, she saw my mother and father hanging themselves from the ceiling. At that moment, my uncle arrived home and witnessed Aunt Zainab seeing this event. Aunt Zainab ran home and did not tell anyone about what she had seen. My uncle, fearing that Aunt Zainab had witnessed these events, also cast a kind of spell on her. Aunt Zainab's tongue was tied, and my uncle had hidden the gold coins from the treasure in the barn. However, one day, when he went to retrieve them, he couldn't find the gold and began to regret what he had done. Aunt Zainab never forgave my uncle, despite his repeated attempts to seek forgiveness. I was in great astonishment upon hearing this story. Kamal uncle said we needed to look into the barn, and we went there together. We took the animals out and started cleaning the barn. I told Kamorn uncle about the place where I saw the snake, and he asked me to bring a shovel from outside. Taking the shovel, we started digging the spot where I had seen the snake. While digging, Kamal uncle was murmuring something in Arabic. Suddenly, the ground shook, and Aunt Zainab started screaming horribly. Dropping the shovel on the ground, I quickly ran to Aunt Zainab along with Halil. We grabbed her by the arm. Aunt Zainab, in a high-pitched tone, was shouting, "Blood will be shed if you don't give back the gold." Kamal uncle opened his hand and began reciting Arabic verses. With each recitation, the trembling intensified, and blood was flowing from Aunt Zainab's mouth. Over time, the intensity of the shaking began to decrease, and Aunt Zainab regained consciousness. Turning to Kamal uncle, she said, "If you don't hurry, they will come here." And looking at me, she mentioned that they would take my life. I immediately took the shovel in my hand and continued digging rapidly. After a while, the shovel hit a hard surface. We unearthed a large chest from the spot we had dug. Kamal uncle asked for a large piece of cloth, so I quickly went back to the house to get it. Kamal uncle forcefully struck the chest on the ground, causing blood to flow from it. I, Halil, and Aunt Zainab were in great astonishment. Kamal uncle calmly covered the flowing blood with the cloth and indicated that we needed to leave immediately. Once outside, he began reciting verses loudly. About half an hour later, he called us inside and instructed us to lift the cloth. When we lifted the cloth, we saw that the blood had been replaced by gold. Kamal uncle requested a large sack to transport the gold. After finding the sack and filling it with the gold, Kamal uncle asked Aunt Zainab where my father and uncle had found the gold. Aunt Zainab mentioned that they found it in a neighboring village, which had been abandoned years ago. I, Halil, and Kamal uncle took the gold and set out on the road. As we arrived in the village, the darkness of the evening began to set in. Kamal uncle explained that such treasures were usually hidden under beech trees. There was only one beech tree in the village. We went to it immediately and started digging. Kamal uncle was reciting Arabic verses again. We dug until we had a hole deep enough to accommodate the gold. Once the hole was ready, we took the gold out of the sack and placed it inside. The sun had completely set. After burying the gold, we set out on the road. On the way back home, I asked Kamal uncle about the significance of the 1951 inscription on the tree at the graves of my parents. Kamal uncle explained that my parents were subjected to a spell in 1951 and died within the same year. Even in death, the jinn didn't leave them in peace, marking the date on the tree at their graves, he said. I still hadn't fully grasped the meaning of this event. Since we had rid ourselves of these things and I was somewhat relieved, I didn't dwell on it too much. By the time we reached home, it was midnight. Kamal uncle and I went to my house. After Halil went to his own home, I prepared Kamal uncle's bed and I lay down in my own bed. When I woke up in the morning, I noticed that Kamal uncle hadn't gotten up yet. I got up, washed my face, went outside, opened the barn door, and let the animals out. I went back inside, and Kamal uncle was still asleep. I didn't want to wake him up due to fatigue. I brewed tea and prepared breakfast. In the meantime, Halil arrived and said, "How are you, my brother? How have you been since we last met?" In surprise, I replied, "We met just yesterday. What are you talking about, my brother?" Halil looked at me strangely. I thought he was behaving strangely due to the events, and I said, "Come on, let's sit down and have breakfast. Kamur and uncle will wake up soon." Halil looked at me and asked, "Who is Kamal uncle?" At first, I thought he was joking, and I smiled. However, Halil's seriousness made me uneasy. I immediately went inside and looked into the room where Kamal uncle was staying, but I couldn't find anyone. I turned to Halil in the courtyard, looking at him with a puzzled expression, and said, "Kamal uncle was staying here, don't you remember?" The bewilderment on Halil's face sent a shiver down my spine. Halil said, "Are you okay, my brother?" Without answering him, I stared at his face for a moment. Then Halil took out a set of prayer beads from his pocket. "I bought this for you from Istanbul, my brother," he said. With these words, a strange unease crept inside me, as if a cold wind had penetrated my being. I began to recount the mysterious events we had experienced together over the last 3 days. However, Halil denied each one, even claiming not to remember Kamal uncle's name. I wanted to show Halil Kamal uncle's house, and we set out together. When we reached the house among the trees, there was nothing in its place. Suddenly, I fainted and opened my eyes in Kamal's house. Zainab aunt had brought water to calm me down. While drinking the water, I asked, "How are you, aunt?" Halil, with a puzzled expression, was looking at me. After giving me a deep gaze, Zainab aunt silently left the room. I couldn't shake off the shock of the events I had experienced. The inscription on the tree at the graves of my mother and father had also disappeared. I no longer wanted to stay in the village. I sold the animals and moved to Istanbul. However, whenever the events came to my mind, I saw my mother and father hanging as in my dreams.
Let's move on to the second story.
Hello, friends. My name is Metin. I am a 45-year-old man who was divorced from his wife. Several years ago, we were leading a happy life together, having married with love. Over the years, I noticed some changes in my wife. After these changes, life became a prison for me. I am not one of those husbands who show violence towards their spouses, so I tried very hard to rectify the mistakes and wrongdoings. When I was 34 years old, there was a man at the workplace whom I could call my brother, named Ahmet. Ahmet used to come to our place frequently with his wife, and we would spend time together. We also visited them as guests. After several months, as our friendship deepened, Ahmet started taking a different attitude towards me and distancing himself. Observing the changes in him, I wondered why he might be doing this. Despite asking him several times if his wife didn't want him to see me, he couldn't give me a clear answer. During that time, Ahmet worked quickly to finish his tasks and left work early. Thinking he might have a problem, one day I discreetly left work early and began to follow him. While he was driving ahead, I followed him from a distance in my car. After arriving in our neighborhood, I started to wonder why he might be here. After a bit more following, he parked his car in front of our house and entered our building. He didn't have any relatives or acquaintances in our building, so I became suspicious that he might come to our place. After waiting for him to enter the building for a while, I followed him and went up to the floor where our apartment was. There were Ahmet's shoes in front of our door. I wondered what business he had in our house and what mess he was causing. Even if my wife was at home, she would take the key out of the door and put it aside. When we came home, we would use the key to open the door. I quietly took off my shoes and slowly opened the door. I listened to the inside for a while. When I heard laughter and intimate sounds, I lost my temper. The sounds were coming from our bedroom. Heading in that direction, I realized that Ahmet was having an affair with my wife, coming to our house every day after work to be with her. I was so enraged at that moment that when I pulled out the knife I always carried, I locked eyes with the woman I called my wife. My so-called wife immediately tried to explain, "Look, Metin, it's not what you think." What else could it be? Not what I thought. They were both standing naked in front of me. Fueled by the sense of inferiority from being betrayed, I attacked both of them with the knife in my hand. I began stabbing Ahmet and the woman who would have been my wife repeatedly. For a moment, the image of my late father came to my mind, and he said, "Metin, don't do it, son. Don't ruin your life." At that moment, I dropped the knife and called the police. I told the police that I caught my wife and my co-worker in bed, and I stabbed them repeatedly. After providing the address, I sat down and waited. The place was literally a pool of blood. Due to the evils they had put me through, I couldn't even look at their faces. Shortly after, the police arrived. After the police came, my son entered and asked, "Dad, what happened here?" I explained the situation to my son. They handcuffed me and took me into custody. I was arrested by the duty court and sent to prison. After that, with trials and hearings, and because the despicable man named Ahmet and the low-life woman I called my wife didn't die, and the situation I faced was considered a mitigating factor, I was sentenced to a total of 8 years in prison. If they had died, I might have gotten a life sentence, not worth it for these people. In prison, I saw that there was a system of power in the cells. There was a cell boss in the cell I was in, the most cursed man I ever knew. While in prison, I did laundry, washed dishes, and cleaned toilets. I was forced to do these tasks because I was the last one to arrive, according to them. After a while, another man came after me. After he came, I only started distributing tea. In this way, in my prison life that started like this, after 3 years, I wasn't doing any work at all. I had plenty of time to think during my time in prison. I wondered if I shouldn't have done it, if it was worth it for them. Occasionally, my son would visit, bringing news from the outside. His mother had married another man, and my son was already staying with his grandmother by his own choice. They say time flies quickly. Before I knew it, 8 years had passed. I'm getting out of prison tomorrow. I entered the prison as a young man at the age of 34, and I'm leaving as an aged 42-year-old with gray hairs, as a changed man. As soon as I got out, I embraced my son and mother. After a week of reuniting with them, I realized it was time to work. I went for job interviews to work as a tower crane operator, just like I used to do. I could easily find a job since there weren't many people doing my job, but who would hire a former convict? That was a bit complicated. After a few job interviews, it happened just as I feared. Companies didn't want to hire me because I was a former convict, thinking I might cause trouble. Nonetheless, I left my phone number with them in case they changed their minds. I came home after searching for a job all day. Sitting at home with a heavy heart, my mother said, "Don't be sad, my son. Your father's pension is here. We can manage for now." I replied, "Thanks, Mom, but I can't stay without working." While eating with little appetite, my phone rang. It was one of the companies I had interviewed with. The person I spoke to said, "We are in a tight spot right now. I was actually very interested in hiring you, but the big boss didn't want it. I'm vouching for you at great risk. We're starting a big project tomorrow. Can you come and work?" I was thrilled with this uplifting news. Now I could send my son to university without worry. The next day, I woke up early and went to the construction site. I examined the tower crane that had been set up beforehand. It looked a bit different from the ones I had used before, like two models combined. I would understand what it was like once I got inside. The site manager asked me to list the crane's specifications to assess my knowledge. It was a bit disheartening for him to ask questions like he was asking a primary school child. I listed what I knew based on my experience. Tower cranes have various features. Usually the standard height of the crane is 66 inches. Additionally, the extending part of the crane, called the boom, is 80 inches. Behind the booms, there are concrete blocks weighing an average of 1.5 tons. These blocks are used to ensure the crane's balanced and healthy lifting. Moreover, when the wind reaches a speed of 50 km/h, the operation should be stopped. Otherwise, the crane may tip over. The manager, listening to what I said, remarked, "Mashallah, you know better than me." I explained that it was due to years of experience, and I assured him that I would do my job properly. If it weren't for the cursed events that happened to me, perhaps I could have earned good money in very different places. On the first day of work, the elevator didn't work when I tried to get on to reach the crane. I shouted from a distance to the manager, "Is the elevator not working?" He replied, "Yes, we'll fix the elevator. Climb up." So, I reluctantly climbed the stairs and sat in the cockpit. Looking around, the whole city was beneath my feet. I felt free and high up just like in the old days. After a while, announcements started coming through the radio. According to the announcements, I was moving loads from one place to another. It was clear how much I missed my job. During lunch break, I descended dozens of stairs to go down. I think the most challenging part of my job was going up first and then down the tower. Some models had an elevator, but this model's elevator was broken. I had to climb up, which was not easy. One worker must have heard from somewhere that I was a former convict because a young guy suddenly said, "Hey, you were inside. Why did you come in?" I was irritated by this question. I was afraid that if I reacted strongly, they might misunderstand me. So, I kept quiet, finished my meal, and headed towards my crane. In the evening, after completing all the work, I descended from the crane in the darkness of the night. All the workers had already left in their cars. I thought they might have forgotten me. I went to the guardhouse to find the guard and call the site foreman. I hadn't thought to get his number on the first day. When I got to the booth, it was empty. Let me wait for a while. They will come, I thought. I entered the booth, and there was a mobile phone inside. Well, if the phone is here, they will come soon, I said. I assumed maybe he went to the bathroom. The gas stove next to me was boiling tea. I might as well have a cup of tea, I thought. I poured some tea into the cup, and as I was about to add hot water, I noticed something in the water. Looking closely, I saw something resembling mouse droppings in the water. My stomach turned when I saw this. Can tea be like this? I went outside. I better pour this out, I said, looking for a place to pour it. I threw the boiling water onto the trash can. At that moment, I heard a faint squeaking sound. What happened there? I went to the trash can but couldn't see anything. Did I unintentionally harm an animal? Maybe a cat came, I thought. After looking around for a while and not finding anything, I went to the kettle to fill it with water. When I went into the booth, the guard was sitting there. I asked him for the foreman's number. After getting the number, I called and said, "You forgot about me. They are on their way back. Wait." After a short chat with the guard, the man from behind knocked on the door. The guy outside said, "What are you doing inside? What are you waiting for?" Then he looked at my hand and said, "What is my phone doing in your hand?" I was shocked when he asked, "Who are you?" I took the phone from the guard, pointing to the seat. However, the seat was empty. "What's going on?" I rubbed my eyes. I put the phone there and went out. A few moments ago, there was a guard here, and I asked, "Who are you?" The guy replied, "I'm the actual guard. Are you okay in the head, brother?" He asked what I was doing with my phone. After a brief argument with the guy, I told him everything that had happened to me. Even though he didn't believe me, I said I was the new crane operator. After some tense moments between us, he attempted to make himself some tea. When he lifted the tea, he asked, "Who emptied this water?" To avoid further tension, I said, "I don't know." After a while, the site manager arrived, and I joined them in the car. In the car, the guy who irritated me was sitting quietly beside me. Reluctantly, I sat next to him, took out my phone, and started fiddling with it. While exploring, he leaned over and again asked, "Why did you go inside, man?" I repented, looking ahead without answering. After a while, he nudged my shoulder and said, "Why did you go inside, man? Whom did you kill? You seem to like killing. I know your type, murderers like you." Unable to endure it, I grabbed his throat. "What are you saying?" I started slapping the guy. A few people held me back. After the driver stopped the car, they made me get out to calm down. The site manager asked, "What happened? Why did you hit the kid?" I said, "He asked me nonsense questions, and I couldn't take it." The kid, coming down, said, "Brother, why are you hitting me? I just told you that you do your job very well and asked how you were. You started hitting me for no reason. I won't ask about your well-being anymore." I apologized to the kid right away. "Come on, guys. I must have lost my temper," I said, getting back into the car. First, the incident with the guard, and then with the kid began to confuse my mind suddenly. Maybe I'm having hallucinations. I must be tired because I haven't worked for many years. Anyway, I went home, hoping it would get better. The house smelled delicious from the inside. My son had come home from school, studying in his room for university exams. My mother came and hugged me, saying, "How was it, my son? Did you like your job? Did you get very tired?" I said, "No, Mom, I'm not tired. I'm fine, sitting down at the table. What did you cook? It smells so good, I said. My mother brought the pot to the table. Put the dishes. He was studying. I'll call him, she said. When I opened the pot, suddenly steam started rising from it. Whatever she did, it was always piping hot. Oh, it smells great. We'll eat it hot, I said. I wondered what she did as I looked inside the pot. Suddenly, my stomach churned and I closed the lid. There was human feces inside the pot. Maybe I'm hallucinating again, I thought, opening the lid and looking inside. This time, the smell of human excrement replaced the delicious aroma of the food. Feeling nauseous, I somehow sat down, and my son and mother came from inside. When they sat at the table, my mother said, "Son, why haven't you put the dishes yet?" I said to my mother, "Mom, don't talk nonsense. You put something in the pot. Are we going to eat that?" My mother's face fell as she opened the lid. "Son, why are you needlessly hurting me? There's kidney bean stew in the pot," she said. I lowered my head and looked into the pot again. Indeed, it was as my mother said. "Okay, Mom, sorry. I had a tough day," I said, kissing her hand. This time, something sticky came into my mouth. "Mom, what's on your hand?" I asked. My mom said, "Nothing, my son. It's okay. I just washed them." When I wiped my hand on my mouth, I realized that this time what had stuck to my lips was human filth. I quickly rushed to the bathroom. I was about to lose my mind. What was happening to me? I had started to see absurd things. Suddenly, the best thing seemed to be to eat, take a nice bath, and then go to sleep. I went inside thinking that I would rest when I sleep. After eating, I focused on my mom's face. Pulling her with the sink loudly, I stared at my mom's face. My son said, "Dad, don't scare us. What happened? Why are you acting weird out of nowhere?" I couldn't tell them what I had seen. I thought they would get upset if they saw me in a bad state, and it would pass in a little while. "God forgive me," I said. Half of my mom's face was melting. In fact, her skin had melted in such a way that it was dripping onto the table like a plastic piece. Rubbing my eyes a bit, I said, "I'm going to the bathroom." While going to the bathroom, my mom was trying to calm down my son. She would say, "Don't worry. I think your dad is fine. He hasn't been working for a long time, probably tired." After I entered the bathroom, I started undressing. I was waiting for the water to warm up while turning on the tap. After a while, when the water did not warm up, I took a towel and went to the kitchen where the boiler was. I set the temperature of the water to the highest degree from the boiler. I went back into the bathroom and waited for the water to heat up again. It wasn't too hot when I reached out. The boiler was probably broken. Well, at least the water had reached a suitable temperature for a bath. After half an hour of bathing, I came out relaxed, got dressed, and went to the living room to see what was going on with my family. When my son saw me, he said, "Dad, what happened to you?" I asked, "What's wrong, my son?" "Grandma, run, you need to see my dad," he said in panic, adding, "I'm calling an ambulance." I wondered what was happening. Maybe they were playing a joke on me. When my mom saw me, she said, "My son, what happened to you? You're as red as a beet. Doesn't it hurt? What did you do in the bathroom? Did you pour acid on yourself?" I went to the mirror in the living room in amazement. Oh my God, every part of my body was bright red, as if I had been sunburned for hours in the sun, I thought. I tried to calm my son down and said, "Hold on, let me not deal with you for a moment." At that moment, I remembered that I had increased the water temperature. "I hadn't noticed the temperature at that time," I said. Suddenly, when I came to my senses, I started to feel pain as if they were repeatedly sticking needles into my body. I asked my mom to turn on the fan. I was burning where I stood, thinking to myself how I could do such a foolish thing. The water I felt was slightly warm, meaning it was lukewarm. How did I take a bath without realizing that the water was so hot? I said. I stood in front of the fan to relax. My mom brought burn cream from inside and applied it all over my body. I'm going to bed now. Hopefully, it will get better by morning. I have to go to work, I said, lying down. Although I struggled to sleep for a while, when I opened my eyes, it was morning. When I looked in the mirror, there was some redness on my face, but it didn't prevent me from working. I went to the front of the house and started waiting for the bus. When the bus arrived, I got on and went to work. I sat next to the boy I had slapped the day before, extended my hand and said, "Sorry about yesterday, brother." He replied, "It's okay, no big deal," shaking my hand. When we arrived at the workplace, the most challenging part of my shift began. I complained about climbing stairs, saying they couldn't get an elevator fixed. After going up, I sat down and started doing my job. According to the commands coming through the radio, I was moving materials from one place to another. After completing a fine and clean job, it was time for lunch break. By the time I descended from the crane, 15 minutes had already passed. Descending was the easiest part, but I still had to be careful. A small mistake could result in a fall from meters above. After descending, I went to the container where lunch was served, took my meal, and started eating. I also tried to engage in conversation to get to know the people working there. When a few people joined the conversation, I had the opportunity to get to know them. One of them said, "Honestly, man, I've never seen someone as skillful as you. You lift and place it with precision. Hats off to you." I thanked them, mentioning that I've been doing this job for years, and it has become second nature to me. The kid I had slapped the other day came up to me again and said, "Bro, you used to be an ex-con. Why didn't you tell us why you went to prison? Come on, spill the beans." I hesitated, wondering if it was real or just a figment of my imagination. When a few people looked at me, I thought they probably wanted me to tell the story, saying my wife cheated on me might have been hard for me. I didn't want to revisit that incident in my mind. Maybe this much insistence, this much effort had put me on edge. Suddenly, getting angry, I raised my voice and started telling the story somehow. One of my colleagues had been leaving the workplace early constantly lately. I wanted to see if there was something bothering him. Then, I saw him entering our neighborhood and subsequently our building. I got suspicious and followed him upstairs. When I heard intimate sounds coming from our house, I quietly opened the door and took out the knife from my pocket. Seeing them naked in the bedroom, I mercilessly started stabbing them in their abdomens, kidneys, one after another, stabbing them, letting their blood flow. When it turned into a pool of blood, I realized how much I enjoyed stabbing them. Let it happen again. I'll stab them again. The red marks left by the knife entering and exiting the body were taking me out of myself. All my pain, sorrow, and anger were draining away. As they writhed on the floor in a pool of blood, I stabbed a bit more. Just when I was about to stab their throats, I left them to their fate, thinking, it's not worth it for these ones. The cries of pain they emitted echoed in my ears like lullabies. As I narrated all these actions, I seemed to be in a trance. With the embellishments from my imagination, I frightened all my co-workers with what I was telling. Many of them had abandoned their meals and were watching me. Some were visibly frightened and couldn't even look at me. I stood up and left their side. I climbed up the stairs to the tower to finish the pending tasks and bring them back down. While climbing the stairs, I continued to mutter, "Damn these stairs, up and down, never ending." I had a nervous breakdown. I was supposed to start working as soon as the crane reached the top, following the command from the radio below. However, not a single sound came from the radio down there. I said a few times, "I'm waiting for your command. Speak up." When there was still no response, I started yelling in frustration. After yelling for a while, incomprehensible signals started coming through the radio. I thought they might be mocking me. After sitting for a while, I heard a psst sound from behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. Who could be inside the crane at a height of 66 meters? Feeling a bit startled and more uneasy, I continued to wait. When I heard the psst sound again from behind, I turned around. My heart was almost jumping out of my chest. Starting to pray, it would be appropriate to say that I waited to die. In front of me was a being with a pitch-black face, tall, long hair with chains placed as if randomly in the middle, almost resembling dreadlocks. Pointing to a small creature in its arms, it said, "You burned my son with boiling water. I'm going to burn you." My tongue was tied and I had no idea what to do at 66 meters in height. I couldn't pass by it and go down. I was almost losing my mind. Suddenly I focused on the small demon-like figure it held in its hand. With the boiling water I threw, half of his body had literally melted. In that moment, I prayed profusely, closed my eyes, pleaded with Allah, and started crying, saying, "Please rescue me from here." After a while, a voice came through the radio. "Come on, Mehmet, we're waiting for you. If you've calmed down, get back to work already," they were saying. When I looked back and didn't see anyone, I snapped out of it. "Okay, if you've secured it, I'm pulling it," I said, and started carrying the load. After a difficult evening, the air had slowly darkened. Descending the stairs in the darkness, the same sounds echoed in my ears. I was quite scared due to the high-pitched screeching of a creature and the psst sounds. When I finally reached the bottom, everyone was looking at me strangely. When I sat in the bus, separated from everyone else, the site manager came to me. "It's clear that you have a problem. Normal people can't narrate what you just did. If you've experienced something, let me help you. I know a famous scholar. If there's an evil eye or possession, he can resolve it. If you need help, don't hesitate to tell me because a friend of mine went through the same things as you did, and apparently he was possessed. This scholar I mentioned helped him," he said. I thanked him and said, "Okay." I headed home, and when I entered, delightful smells filled the air again. This time, no matter what I saw, I wouldn't make any moves to harm my mom and son. Clearly, when I threw that boiling water outside, I had attracted some malevolent presence. Unknowingly, I had harmed a supernatural entity. The best thing is to ask for help from the boss after going to work tomorrow, or consult a scholar if necessary. Seek assistance. Otherwise, I won't be able to carry on with my life like this. I've just been released from prison. I couldn't risk doing something wrong and going back in. After having dinner without any issues, I went to bed. I woke up in the early morning to the sound of my son's scream. Running to him, I grabbed his hand and asked, "What happened, son? Why are you screaming?" My son said, "Dad, I had a really bad dream. I probably screamed because of that. I'm not even aware of it." When I asked, "What happened? Tell me." He replied, "No. If I tell you, I'll lose sleep. It was a weird thing. I'll tell you tomorrow." "All right, whenever you're ready," I said, and then I went back to my room. As soon as I laid my head on the pillow, it was time for the alarm to go off. Damn, I just checked the time. It was 2 in the night. When did it become morning? I sat up, complaining about my sore body, and went out to the street to go to work. Getting on the bus, I leaned my head against the window. As soon as I did, I heard a tick-tick sound from the window. Startled, I looked at the reflection on the car window, and there was a supernatural being appearing to me at a height of 66 meters. It was saying, "You killed my son. You harmed my son. You burned him." Terrified, I sat still looking outside, and the boss sat next to me. When the boss sat next to me, I snapped out of it and said, "Boss, You mentioned yesterday about going to that scholar together, right? The boss replied, "Sure, okay. After work, let's go together, and we'll have him take a look at you." Thanking him, I leaned my head against the window again. This time, the reflection of that supernatural being was not there on the window. He would appear and disappear. What was he trying to convey, I wondered. When I went to work, I stood under the crane. Those stairs had grown quite daunting in my eyes. Climbing them felt like torture now. Deep down, I also feared, I wonder if he will appear to me again at the top of the tower. Compelled, I had to endure until the evening and do my job. As I climbed the stairs slowly, I felt the soles of my feet burning. Due to this heat, my body was drenched in sweat. Climbing only 50 steps and being covered in blood and sweat like this was not logical at all. After working a bit more, I leaned to the right to drink water. When I opened the cap of the water bottle and brought it to my mouth, I sprayed the water back with a burning sensation. Despite being in the cold shade, the water had turned into boiling water. All this happened just because I unknowingly poured that boiling water near the trash. I prayed for this curse to end and for me to be freed. When lunchtime came, I went downstairs again. No one who saw me dared to speak. I told them. I admitted that I exaggerated the story I told yesterday. I am not the person you think I am. I've made mistakes just like any man who has been deceived before. I paid for it in full afterward. Lately, my nerves have been shot. Sorry about that, I said. The workers there supported me, saying, "No problem, brother." After having lunch, feeling proud and happy for the support, I started working for the afternoon. After climbing so many stairs, I reached the cabin. Since the chair I was going to sit in was a 360-degree swivel chair, I started turning it towards myself with my hand to sit. Just as I was about to sit down, a screeching sound came. "Oh God, I seek refuge in you for all my sins," I started praying. On the chair, the supernatural being showed me on the first day, it appeared to me, was standing. Smoke was constantly coming out of it, and it was squealing with deep breaths. As the intensity of the squealing gradually increased, I couldn't bear this sound anymore. I wonder if I should try to grab it with my hand and put it aside, I thought. Or should I close my eyes and wait to see if it goes away? Although I waited for a while with my ears closed for the sound to pass, closing my ears was not a solution. Disgusted, I attempted to pick up the sitting being. I inserted my hand into what I considered the abdominal area, the area that moved when breathing. My hand started to feel an extreme burning sensation. It started to burn a lot, as if I had grasped a piece of fire and was lifting it. I couldn't bear the pain, and at some point I even considered throwing it. However, I concluded that throwing it wouldn't be right because something always happened to me due to my own mistakes. Slowly, enduring the pain, I placed it in a corner and sat in my chair. The chair had also become very warm from the warmth of that being. I had to sit and stand for a while to get used to the heat. I announced that I was ready over the radio. While my work continued, about 2 tons of material needed to be placed on the upper floors. They attached the material to the crane's hook. Carefully manipulating the crane from the console, I first lifted the materials into the air, then turned the tower towards the place I was going to release them. Just as I was about to lower them, a sudden squealing sound started right next to my ear. In a momentary reflex as I tried to cover my ear, my hand quickly hit the control lever. The impact caused the materials to be scattered rapidly from side to side. Just before they were about to fall, I skillfully slowed them down in a balanced manner. If those materials had fallen, I could have ended up working for free for 3 months. I thanked God that I was the only one who saw the materials scattered like that. I didn't want them to think I was a novice. Everyone else was busy with other tasks. Taking a deep breath, I looked in the direction from which the squealing sound came. The being had risen, wandering from side to side in the cockpit with its half-melted body emitting flames. It moved to a corner and left its excrement there. After that moment, I remembered that the smell of that excrement was similar to what I had seen and smelled in my mother's cooking. All these excrements, burnings, apparitions, and disturbances were starting to get on my nerves. In the evening, I quickly went downstairs, found the supervisor, and said, "Boss, please let's go now. I'm not feeling well at all." The boss said, "Okay, come on. Let's take the shuttle to the city center. From there, we'll take a bus to a nearby district." After reaching the district, we walked a bit. After climbing a steep hill overlooking the mountain part of the district, we found a single-story house at the end. Hanging from the roof of the house, dozens of padlocks were connected to chains. On the locks, there were Arabic letters that resembled writing with red nail polish. I encountered this very interesting sight for the first time in my life. When we approached the steel door to knock, we realized that even the door knocker was padlocked. There were Arabic letters written in blue on it. I thought there was definitely something strange about this house. Since the moment I went there, I had an inexplicable headache and a strange discomfort inside me. It felt like someone was pulling me from behind. After knocking on the door, it opened after a while. I was stunned when an old woman opened the door. She had painted symbols on her face with black paint, and there were round and various patterned symbols on her forehead and chin. Looking at me, she said, "Welcome, Mehmet. I was also expecting you," which surprised me. I turned to the boss and said, "Did you tell her, boss?" He, quite surprised, couldn't hide his astonishment and said, "No, I didn't. I swear." The woman invited us inside. As we entered, candles were burning in every corner of the house, and there was an incense next to them. The atmosphere in the house was so gloomy and dark that for a moment I felt like I was suffocating inside. She led us into a room and asked us to sit. Turning to me, she said, "I know why you came. Just before you arrived, the jinn told me their situation. You hurt the child of a jinn. By what wisdom would you pour boiling water into the trash without reciting prayers? Garbage dumps are their favorite places. Don't you know that?" Turning to the boss, she sought my approval and I nodded. I pleaded with the woman, "Please save me. I won't do it again." I asked her, "Can't you communicate with jinns?" She said, "It doesn't work that way. Tell me what happened to you." I narrated what happened to me in the days following the water pouring. After listening to what I had to say, the woman had me sit in front of her. "I will communicate on your behalf. Don't open your eyes no matter how much your hands burn or even if they fall off. And let's not bother with you anymore," she said. The boss sat in a chair on the side watching us. I knelt down, palms open. The woman wrote Arabic words on 2 pieces of paper and placed them separately in the palms of my hands. She said, "Close your palms, keep your eyes open." Placing a basin under my palms, she started pouring water from the jug next to her towards my closed palms. The poured water into my palms was filling the basin below, but steam began to rise from the water in the basin after a while. I was surprised when it started boiling vigorously. Looking at the boss, I would understand if he saw this. He was also quite astonished, staring at the boiling water in disbelief. "Now close your eyes. It's going to burn a lot. Shout as much as you want, but don't open your eyes," she said. Closing my eyes, I awaited the move the woman would make. She grabbed my closed palms and submerged them into the lower basin. At that moment, I felt as if there was a fire inside me, burning fiercely. It was a pain far more intense than the agony of the jinn's affliction. After a while, I started screaming at the top of my lungs, feeling as if my hands were melting. When the woman suddenly pulled my hands out of the water, I realized that my hands were now freezing cold. I had no idea what was happening at this moment. "Okay, you can open your eyes now. I spoke through my own jinns. they will forgive you. However, they want a gift from you, she said. Now, I'm going to cut you somewhere, and I'll drip your blood onto a piece of bread for you. After letting that bread mold in a sealed bag for 10 days, you'll crumble it on the edge of the trash. Once they taste your blood, they will leave you alone, she said. I replied, all right, cut wherever you want. Just get rid of this affliction, I said. The woman stood up, went inside, grabbed a knife and a piece of bread, and came back to me. She read something and blew on the knife. Then, as she rubbed the knife into the palm of my hand, she seemed to go into a trance, experiencing something. I didn't understand what was happening at that moment. After a while, when she came to herself, she dripped blood from her palm onto the bread. When the part inside the bread turned out to be blood, she put it into a white bag and handed it to me. Okay, is it done? I asked. The woman, in a melancholic tone, said, it's done, but I saw one more thing. When I rubbed the knife on your hand, I witnessed the pain you were experiencing. Your ex-wife is in a very difficult situation right now. Have you ever tried to contact her? I was surprised at how she could know that, then said, I'm not talking to her. I never tried to reach her. After she cheated and left, I never contacted her. May you keep your humanity. I regret a lot for what you've done. Right now, she's in a very tough situation. You may want to see her, she said. I don't know where to find her, I said. I was sleeping behind the large mosque in the center. Anyway, you'll have time to leave the bread for 10 days. You can also take care of her, she suggested. I said okay, thanked her, and left. Turning to the boss, I hugged him and said, Bro, may God be pleased with you. Without you, I could never have found this woman. You saved my life. Thank you so much. When we arrived at the center, I parted ways with the boss, saying, see you. I thought, let me go to the back of the mosque in the center. I wonder what my ex-wife is doing. When I got there, I looked around for her but couldn't find her. Then at the corner of the mosque, I saw a homeless person lying on cardboard. When I bent down to look at her, I realized it was my ex-wife. Nazik, what are you doing here? How long have you been in this condition? I asked. She lifted her head and looked at me. Her eyes lit up when she saw me. No one accepted me, Matan. I went hungry, slept on the streets. I've been suffering since the day I betrayed you, and no one gave me a job. One day, I'll die in the cold here, she said. At that moment, I felt great pity for her situation, forgetting my own troubles, and I took her arm. Yeah, you cheated on me, but I made you pay for it by stabbing you. While I was in prison, you were on the streets, and your family and relatives didn't accept you. I took her with me, saying, come on. We took the bus home. Wait outside for me. I'll bring you in shortly, I said. I entered and called my son to join me. Have you ever seen your mother? What is she doing? Have you checked? I asked. My son said, no, I never even bothered to look. Why would I search for the woman who caused all this trouble for us, Dad? I said, okay, son, and went to see my mother. Mom, I found my ex-wife Nazik. She's living on the streets, I said. Bending over to my mother's ear, I said, if you allow, let me take care of her until she gets back on her feet. Do you agree? I'm feeling a lot of guilt, I said. My mother said, you know best, my son, whatever you say. So I went out and invited Nazik inside, saying, come, Nazik. You can stay here until you get back on your feet, I said. Nazik cried and prayed for me. When she entered, my son was shocked to see his mother. The mother he knew had completely changed. He hesitated to hug her or not, then returned to his room. First, I took Nazik to the bathroom to clean up. When I saw the scars on her body, I felt sorry, thinking about how ruthless I had been. I cried there out of sorrow, realizing what a person can do when overwhelmed by emotions. After 10 days, I took moldy bread to get rid of the affliction on my head. I reached there before dawn, crushed the bread in the trash, and prayed. I hoped that from now on I would be free from this affliction. Although since I visited the sorceress, nothing extraordinary happened to me, I prayed that I wouldn't experience any more incidents in the future, and my prayers were answered. Since that day, no dreadful events occurred, and all the negativity left my life. Deciding to make a change in my life, I chose to forgive Nazik. Although my son struggled to accept this decision, the longing for his mother must have been heavy on him, and he too forgave her. Nazik and I remarried. I hope that from now on we can continue our lives more happily.
Let's move on to the third story.
Now close your eyes and imagine this scene. You have a sorcerer aunt. With her coal black eyes, your aunt is giving you a bath when you were a child. While washing, she keeps uttering something with a continuous sound from her throat. Then she takes her hand to places where you shouldn't be touched, and as she says something, her pupils suddenly go backward, and her body starts to tremble. Then, a pitch-black smoke comes right behind her and enters your mouth. I was sick for days, constantly having nightmares. It felt like there was someone inside me. Sometimes when speaking, a crackling voice, and sometimes a very deep male voice would come out. My mom and dad were very surprised. My name is Azra. I live in Ankara with my family, and my aunt lives in the next house. It all started when my mom entrusted me to my sorcerer aunt when she went to the hospital. My aunt was a filthy sorceress who deceived people under the guise of prayer and sessions, taking their money. My mother would constantly warn her to quit this business, but my aunt wouldn't stop. That's because she loved money a lot. As I grew up, whatever was inside me was growing with me. My aunt had warned me countless times not to tell anyone about the incident that day. Everyone in the neighborhood already knew about my aunt's jinn, and sometimes she would even threaten me with her jinn. One day, I said to my aunt, "Why did you do such a thing? There's something inside me, and sometimes it bothers me. I'm really scared. Aren't you afraid something will happen to me?" My aunt laughed. "Don't worry. Would I wish harm upon you? Everything is for your own good," she said. Years passed, and during my adolescence, my aunt started constantly asking me if I had started menstruating. I had already started, but I kept saying no to my aunt. When I asked why she was asking this, she would say, "When a young girl enters womanhood, there will be some changes in her body. I'm asking to support you." And it had indeed started happening. Nights in my bed felt like there was someone else with me. On nights when hands roamed my body, I would wake up drenched in cold sweat. The dark circles under my eyes became intense due to sleepless nights because I had lost any semblance of a sleep routine. After a while, my aunt noticed this happening and asked me why I hadn't told her. I said, "Aunt, I'm scared," and she replied, "Don't be afraid." One night, she insisted that I stay at her place. Despite my mother's objections, she took me by the arm and brought me to her house. I always feared her house, a gloomy and foul-smelling place. I was going to spend a night in the house of a known woman with magical abilities and jinn. Let's see what would happen to me. Close to midnight, my aunt warmed some milk for me. "Come on, drink and lie down," she said. Even though I said I wouldn't drink, she forced a few sips into my mouth. Later, I went to my bed. My aunt and I were supposed to sleep in separate rooms. Sleep wouldn't come, but eventually, my mind started to drift off, and I would suddenly jerk awake. Finally, I noticed someone at the door. I sat up and said, "Aunt, is that you?" It wasn't my aunt. Someone covered my mouth from behind and laid me down on the bed. They held onto my hands and feet. The man standing in the darkness by the door approached. I couldn't see his face or body in the darkness. That night, he assaulted me repeatedly. It lasted for hours. I couldn't make a sound or move. At one point, I saw my aunt peeking through the door, but by then, everything was over, and they had left me. I started crying, overwhelmed by fear. My aunt came and asked what happened. Trembling with fear, I tearfully recounted what had occurred. My aunt said, "Don't worry, everything will be okay." Inside, I thought, what will be okay? They ruined me. My aunt took me to the bathroom, undressed me, and started crying when she looked at my body. I looked at my hands, and even my arms were covered in scratch marks up to my wrists. There were also marks on my belly and legs. My aunt had heated water. When she poured it on my back, it started to burn. There were cuts on my back as well. Now, what was I going to tell my parents? How would I face them? I returned home in the morning, and when my mother saw my condition, she went crazy. "What happened to you?" she exclaimed. I told my mother about what had happened to me that night. My mother had a nervous breakdown, and my father put his head in his hands and sank to the floor. Then suddenly, he got up and started shouting at my mother. "I told you, your sorceress sister would cause trouble for us. She not only caused trouble but brought disaster upon us. Damn such a sister, damn her!" he yelled. My mother stormed out in anger, and she started throwing stones at my aunt's house. My father joined her. My aunt didn't take a single step outside. She just looked from the window and went inside. My parents tried to force open the house door, but they couldn't. Then they called the police. The police took my aunt away. My parents filed a complaint, but my aunt was released the next day. I couldn't sleep that night until morning. Actually, after what I experienced in that house, I couldn't have a peaceful sleep for the rest of my life. The next day, my parents attacked my aunt's house again. The police came again. Some people from the neighborhood had told the police that my aunt practiced sorcery. The police took my aunt away again, but they released her a few days later.
The day she was released, she came to our house and said, "We are no longer siblings. Fear me." She stayed inside her house until my parents went downstairs.
That night, my parents argued until late hours. After midnight, the lights went out, and it became quiet. I was in my bed, waiting for what would happen because my aunt had said, "Fear me." First, I heard the door of the house opening. Then the items inside the house started breaking one by one. My parents were screaming in terror. I opened the door of my room and walked towards the living room. My parents were running in all directions. Objects in the house were flying on their own, crashing to the ground and shattering into pieces. Vases, display cabinets, photo frames, even the chairs. I watched with my eyes wide open, like a fortune teller stone, observing everything that was happening. This time, the kitchen items started breaking. My parents were screaming in terror, bewildered about what to do. When the mirror in the bathroom suddenly shattered, the house turned into a war zone. Just when we thought everything was over, the surroundings of the house caught fire. My mother was looking out the window. At that moment, the carpets on the floor also suddenly caught fire. My dad grabbed me and ran towards the door, my mom following behind. We threw ourselves out of the house in desperation. In seconds, the house turned into a ball of flames. We helplessly watched the house burning. My mother was screaming. Then, my dad wanted to attack my aunt's house, but a man who suddenly appeared at the door of my aunt's house made us all step back. The man was 2 meters tall and completely black. My dad grabbed my arm and said, "Run." As we ran down the street, we saw that the house of our neighbor who had reported my aunt to the police as a sorceress was also on fire. Seeing this, the neighbors rushed inside and closed their doors, fearing we might seek refuge in their homes. Everyone was afraid of my aunt's jinn. We went to my uncle's house and stayed there for days. My mom started searching for a religious teacher for me. Together with my aunt, they went door to door, but couldn't find any results. Finally, they said they found someone, but he asked for a lot of money. We helplessly started waiting. There was no one left who would do this for the sake of God's approval. Weeks were passing. We had nowhere to go, but my aunt had started giving us dirty looks. They were silently arguing in their rooms with my uncle. My dad and mom heard this, but neither of them could do anything about it. After a while, my dad rented a house close to where he worked. We moved in with some broken and damaged furniture from here and there. However, there was a problem. I wasn't menstruating. When I told my mom about this, she started pounding her knees without crying. In the evening, when my dad came home, she explained the situation. My dad suggested going to the teacher who asked for a lot of money. My mom asked, "How will you get the money?" And my dad replied, "I'll ask my brother for it." When he returned late at night, he was in a very bad mood. I overheard them talking while my mom and dad were conversing. My dad had asked for a loan from my uncle, and my uncle asked, "How will you pay it back?" My dad explained the situation, but my uncle wanted my dad's share from the ancestral land in the village. When my father said, "That place is our child's future," my uncle responded, "Don't we have our own child? We should also consider their future." My father looked into my uncle's eyes, tears streaming down, and reluctantly said, "Okay." My uncle handed over the money, and my father, stating that our brotherhood had reached its limit, left. Showing the money in his jacket pocket to my mother, he said, "Look, dear, it's because of this. Siblings don't recognize each other because of this. Siblings betray each other. What had come upon my family because of me?" The next day, my mother, father, and I went to that man. He wasn't really a teacher, more like a medium. A man who had turned this into a business, with the door of an office building labeled medium. In his 40s, with a bandana on his head and a bracelet on his wrist. "Tell me your problem," he said, appearing somewhat arrogant. He began to explain to my mother. I sat there, hands between my knees, trembling with shame. The man interrupted my mother and said, "I understand, my brother. I understand. This girl will give birth to a jinn baby." My father was furious. "Sort this out, sir, or I'll end up in prison or the grave," he said. The man looked and asked for a considerable sum in the currency of that time. My father gave him all the money in his jacket pocket. The man seemed to know the money in my father's pocket, as if he already knew. He took the money and said, "Now I have an offer for you. We can make her miscarry, but I have one offer that will ensure this money stays in your pocket." My father asked, "What is that?" The man replied, "You will allow the baby to be born. You will bring her here near the delivery. I guarantee she will give birth, and we will take the baby," he said. My father stood up. "What are you saying? Is this baby a jinn baby?" he asked. The man calmly responded, "Yes, this baby is a jinn baby. It could harm you, but nothing will happen in our hands. We will raise it and use it in our business," he said. My father angrily replied, "No, absolutely not. You will destroy this baby. I cannot allow that. What if it harms my daughter, or something happens to her?" The man said, "Okay, calm down. We can do it your way then." Then he added, "Not today. The business center is crowded. We need to do this at night. How will it happen?" My father asked. The man said, "Now go. After PM. No one will be here. No one will suspect anything," he said. My father agreed. Okay. We went back after PM. The man, along with a girl he called Malik, took me into a room. The man had prepared a mixture. "You will drink this, and you will relax, my girl. But first, I'll give you an injection," he said. The man administered the injection. At that moment, there was a stir in my stomach. Is it this early? Is this how it happens? I wondered to myself. I had no knowledge about anything related to pregnancy. The man waited for a moment and then brought the mixture, handing it to me. At that moment, things in the room began to tremble, and someone hid the glass in my hand. But it was not a medium or anything like it. The glass fell to the floor and shattered. The medium and his sister started to get scared. Of course, objects around me started to move slowly. When the medium turned towards the door, wondering what was happening, he received a blow as if he had hit his head on the wall. He fell head first to the ground, and his sister turned into a statue. The man tried to get up from the floor, stumbled, and then someone lifted him by the throat into the air and threw him against the wall. The man lost consciousness. Meanwhile, my parents entered the room. "What's happening?" they asked, and I was crying. "Dad, he's here," I said. "Who?" my father asked, and I pointed to my stomach. I said, "The one who did this." I knew it was him because I have his child in my stomach. The woman, without moving from her place, was reading something. My father took me out of there immediately. We rushed downstairs since it was on the first floor. When we reached the bottom, the windows of the place shattered. We quickly left the area and went home. He didn't want me to miscarry. He was willing to do anything for the baby to be born. While in bed at night, I felt a hand moving on my stomach. I couldn't move. I waited without even taking a breath for a while. I could feel it, and then it withdrew. The next day, my father went back to the office of that medium. Fortunately, the man was okay, and we got our money back. The medium said to my father, "You don't know what you're dealing with. You need to be very careful. If you want, I can provide counseling for you." My father laughed. We saw enough yesterday, thanks, he said. My mother had returned to work in the meantime. We needed a real spiritual guide who did this for the sake of God, not just a medium or a sorcerer. They clearly couldn't solve this issue. I suggested to my mother that we go to the hospital. Sweetheart, you're too young. Not only will they ask who the child is from, but also social services will take you away from us because we couldn't protect you. Besides, forget all that. The baby in your belly is not a normal baby. If the doctors take the baby, you will die, she said. I understood, Mom, I said. I wish I could die. I can't live like this anymore. Besides, once the baby is born, they won't need me, and maybe they'll kill me too. Days passed, and a friend of my father from his workplace unknowingly mentioned a random spiritual guide. While casually talking about it, my father took the address of the spiritual guide. The spiritual guide was in Konya, so my father arranged for a car to go to Konya. However, before leaving the city, the car broke down. The motor oil was leaking all over, and my father had to get the car repaired. Then we found another car, but the tire burst before even leaving the city. We changed it and continued on the road, but this time the other tire burst. They wouldn't allow us to go, but my father didn't give up. We'll go by bus, he said. However, the bus we boarded had an accident. Another bus came and picked up the passengers, but everyone on the bus said they wanted to go back to the city. We still couldn't leave Konya. God, when will this torture end? We wondered. No matter what we did, we couldn't leave the city. One night, while trying to sleep again, I felt something pressing on my throat. I suddenly opened my eyes. There was a weight on me, and a breath was coming towards my face. However, I couldn't see anything. These words were whispered in my ear. Don't bother in vain. This child will be born. If you insist on miscarrying, you will lose your life. If you safely give birth, I will spare your life, it said. Then the weight suddenly lifted, and I had no tears left from crying. My mental health deteriorated. My body became unsteady because I couldn't sleep, and my dark circles were deepening. They thought I was using drugs. I explained to my mom and dad what I experienced that night and what he said. My dad and mom were helpless. My mom said, "So, are we going to trust his word and wait? Is my daughter's life entrusted to them just so this child can be born?" My dad added, "You saw it, dear. No matter what we do, we couldn't leave the city. We've tried everything, and there's nothing left for us but to wait." My mom and I hugged each other, and my mom said, "Patience, my daughter, patience." Months passed, and my belly started to grow. My mom didn't let me go outside because everyone who saw me would ask where this girl's husband is, who the father of this baby is. My mom decided to hide me. Months went by, and my due date approached. At a time when my mom and dad weren't home, my aunt appeared at the door. I looked at her through the window. "Open the door, my girl, I came for you," she said. I asked, "Why did you come?" She replied, "For your own good." So I went and opened the door. She told me that when it's time for delivery, I need to inform her, as the delivery would be done by her. Otherwise, she said the baby, and my family would die. "Why, Aunt? Why did you do this to me?" I asked. My aunt said, "I had no choice. I sent her for a mission, but the spell backfired and haunted me. I had to pay a price. And I gave you. I hate you, Aunt. You stole all my dreams, ruined me," I said. My aunt was crying, but those were crocodile tears. Then she left. My due date was approaching, and I told my mom about my aunt's visit and what she said. My mom cursed her, but at the same time, couldn't stop thinking about how I would give birth. She was going to perform the delivery herself, but she was very afraid, not knowing what she would encounter. As the time for delivery approached, one day when my mom and dad were not at home, I heard a strawberry vendor passing by on the street. I couldn't go outside. I called out to the strawberry vendor from the window, "Can you bring it to the door, sir?" The man didn't refuse, waited, and brought it. As he handed over the strawberries and took the money, he looked into my eyes. Suddenly, my stomach emptied into my hands and feet. "What happened, sir?" I asked. "My dear, he said, and stopped. "What happened, sir? Is it because I'm pregnant?" I asked, and he nodded as if saying no. "Is it because I'm young?" I asked again, and he shook his head indicating no, it's about what's in your belly. he said. Yes, sir, I replied. He leaned close to my ear. This child doesn't belong to this lineage, he said. At that moment, my body trembled. How do you know, sir? I asked. The man smiled and asked if he could come inside. Of course. Come in, sir, I said, and we entered. The strawberry cart was left outside. Don't be afraid, my girl. Those who eat my strawberries, it's lawful, and those who steal, it's forbidden, he said, very relaxed. Then he asked me to tell him what had happened to me. I shared my story, and he nodded. I'll come again tomorrow. When you hear my voice, please open the door, my beautiful girl, he said. Sure, sir, I replied. That night, a glimmer of hope emerged within me. I believed I would be saved now. The next day, I waited for that man, and when I heard his voice, I opened the door. My mom was cleaning in the back room. The man handed me a prayer at the door. Take this prayer. Read it constantly. When you are about to give birth, call your aunt. Let her handle the delivery. The baby belongs to them. Let them take it and go. Let your aunt bear the punishment. You, my innocent girl, this life is now yours, he said. He patted my head and left. As he left, he was shouting, Florist. But how could it be? This man surely had an open third eye, and he might even be a saint. But he was selling strawberries. I was very excited. Allah had sent him to save me. My prayers were being answered, I thought. 2 weeks passed, and my labor pains began. I told my mom to call my aunt, but she insisted that she would deliver the baby, saying she would not call my aunt even if I died. Mom, we have no choice, or we will all die, I said. Stubbornly, my mom had decided she would be the one to deliver me. The pains continued all night, but the baby still wouldn't come. I felt a little better in the morning, but it started again in the evening. Mom, we're all going to die. Call my aunt, I said. When my mom said no again, I told that strawberry vendor. My mom put her hands on her head and said, My girl, why didn't you tell me before? She continued, If your father had gone, it would have ended in a tragedy. I'll go. She dressed up and left. I was alone with my dad, so I told him about the strawberry vendor too. My dad started crying. May Allah be our witness, my girl. He heard our plea. You will be saved, don't worry, he said. About an hour later, my mom and aunt arrived. My dad looked at my aunt as if he would kill her, but he didn't say anything. Then he went outside. My mom and aunt weren't talking at all. My aunt prepared me, and then the labor began. During that time, I could notice different shapes flying in front of my eyes. There was a strange atmosphere. My mom was pacing nervously. My aunt was struggling. And finally, when the baby was born, I screamed. It was as if life stopped at that moment. A man entered. He had a strange appearance. He took the baby in his arms. I couldn't even see the baby. Then he turned to me, said something, but a shield suddenly formed in front of me. I couldn't hear. It didn't affect me at all. My aunt seemed to move in slow motion in her place, staring at that man. My mom wasn't aware of what was happening. When the man looked at my aunt, she seemed to lose her breath and collapsed. Then life returned to normal, and my mom came to her senses. Baby, where's the baby? She asked. I, out of breath, said, He took her, Mom. He took her and left. Who, dear? She asked, and then looked at my aunt. What happened to her? She asked. She paid the price, I said. My dad entered the room. What happened? He asked. They took the baby, Dad. We're saved, I said. My dad said, Thank God, and went to perform a gratitude prayer. My mom looked at my aunt. She was lying flat in the middle of the room. Then she came to me and stopped my bleeding. They buried my aunt that day, and I pulled myself together a few days later. But I couldn't overcome what I had experienced. I closed myself up at home, became weak, and got sick. For years, it felt like I had tuberculosis. Nowadays, I'm doing better, but I still can go outside. However, I know I'll overcome these too, and despite all I've been through, I'll hold on tight to life. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.